It was a bright sunny day. The sky was clear and blue, without a single cloud. The sun was shining brightly and warmly, filling everything around with its radiance. The silence was broken by a large and strong lizard that attacked someone. However, the man turned out to be stronger, and with one precise blow of his dagger, he killed the huge reptile. It turned out to be Sena Rohil, a young girl with black hair falling on her shoulders and eyes as dark as night, who was pleased with her large catch. She was a D-rank hunter of the Adventurers Guild. Her partner, while collecting materials, admired Sena's fighting skills, who defeated D-rank monsters in an instant. The girl, in high spirits, picked up the bags of trophies and headed home. Due to her carelessness, the girl slipped and fell, hitting her head on the ground. At the moment of impact, memories of her past life returned to her. She remembered that she was a simple office worker and once fell asleep while reading a novel. Then she was woken up by another employee who told the heroine that the lunch break was already over and they were late for a meeting. Hearing this, Sena stood up and followed her colleague. On the way, she thought that the story was too boring since the main character ran away, but she decided to finish reading it after the conference. The memories ended abruptly as she woke up as Sena Rohil. Opening her eyes in unfamiliar surroundings, the girl panicked. She didn't understand what these memories were and where the boundaries of reality were. The worried doctor helped the girl to get up. At the same time, collecting her thoughts, the heroine realized that she had been reborn in the book she had read in her previous life. However, to her great regret, she could not remember the whole story, but only the first episodes. Noticing the girl's confusion, the doctors explained to her that she had hit her head very hard, but fortunately was not seriously injured. The doctors suggested that such injuries were common among hunters. Hearing these words, Sena suddenly remembered that usually, hunters who moved into such works acquire unusual powers and abilities. Realizing this, the girl tried to call up the status screen. From the outside, it looked extremely strange. The stunned doctor asked the heroine why she shouted these words. Seeing the abnormal behavior of the patient, the doctor decided that it was a consequence of a blow to the head and gave the order to the nurses to quickly register the girl and immediately prepare her for surgery. Shocked by the situation, Sena swore that she was fine. As she left the hospital, the girl sighed in disappointment as she had to spend all her earnings on the hospital bill, and now she didn't know how she would pay for food this month. At the same time, she still found it hard to believe that she was in a fantasy world. Analyzing her life, she did not understand why she worked so much in her past life and what her role was in this story. Sena assumed that she was not the main character, but also did not know if she was a supporting character. To begin with, the girl decided to remember whether there was a hunter character in that book. Also, oddly enough, she remembered the title of the book, but was not sure about the plot, and the girl also could not remember the name of the main character. Not far from Sena, there stood a young girl with long golden hair, holding a bouquet of flowers in her hands. Hearing a passing boy call this girl by the name Ellen, she remembered that the main character of the novel had the same name. Suddenly, a young man, without a hint of embarrassment, right in the middle of the street, confessed his love to Ellen. Sena was surprised to realize that her neighbor had the same name as the main character of the book. Suddenly, a description of the main character of that story popped into her memory, namely the lines that she was a young girl, the owner of a flower shop named Helen Equals, who was confessed in love every day. Sena was stunned to realize that she had been living next door to the protagonist all this time. However, after making sure that she had indeed moved to the novel, the girl now couldn't understand why, in that case, she didn't have a status screen. All her hopes were shattered into pieces, as it turned out that in this story, she was just an ordinary neighbor. At this time, an embarrassed young man asked Ellen to go out with him. The guy's words confused the girl, but she refused with a blushing face. While the embarrassed couple were in their own little world, Sena was enveloped in a dark aura She was extremely unhappy with her role in this universe. So a month passed since the return of Sena's memories. During this time, she remembered something about the original work. The story revolved around the search for the main male character. So Ellen had to listen to confessions of love every day, which the girl politely refused. And each time these insignificant characters left in tears. As Sena watched Ellen, she noticed that every day only one man confessed his feelings for Ellen. Based on this, the girl assumed that at this rate, it would take forever to find the main character. While Sena was thinking that the confession scene was over for today, suddenly the gust of wind became stronger. It hit the girl's face, causing her hair to fly in all directions. While the irritated girl was fixing her tousled hair, a guy with silver hair walked past her. The girl was very surprised when the young man called Helen. Hearing a familiar voice, Ellen turned around with a smile. When the girl asked if he had come to buy flowers, Dion answered in the negative, saying that he wanted to say something important. Plucking up his courage, the guy confessed his feelings. Ellen was stunned by these words. Without waiting for an answer, Dion ended his confession with a request to marry him. Sena was also shocked by this confession, as Helen had already been confessed to that day. At that moment, the boring rule that had been followed throughout the month was broken. It was amazing and strange, and the reason for this was a guy who didn't look like an insignificant character at all. Shocked, Sena stood motionless, her eyes wide and her mouth slightly open. She couldn't believe her eyes and ears. The excited guy proposed to Ellen. He promised to give her happiness. However, the girl's heart was not touched by these words. She immediately refused. Dion asked for a reason for his answer. Then Ellen justified her refusal by saying that they had only known each other for a month. Only after hearing these words did Dion realize that only a month had passed since their first meeting. However, his feelings were not limited to these times. Sena considered this scene too banal. Sitting on the bench, the heroine watched the couple and was disappointed by the fact that although the rule was broken, the outcome remained the same. Looking at them, she wondered whether events would continue to develop as usual. If this is exactly how it happens, then, first of all, Ellen will turn around and go to the flower shop, after which the man will fall to his knees. When everything happened exactly as she expected, she became completely bored. However, given that the rule was broken, she rated Dion's confession 80 points. After the performance ended, Sena decided to return home. However, the devastated boy was still sitting on the cold ground. The girl didn't know how to react to this. Dion was in the same condition as the others. Every man who confessed his feelings to Helen in front of Sena's house, upon receiving a refusal, immediately fell into despair. That's why the girl wasn't surprised by this scene. However, Dion's condition lasted longer than that of the other candidates. The boy continued crying and calling for Ellen. Looking at Dion's face, Sena noticed that his face stood out from the others. The guy continued to shed tears without stopping. Watching this, Sena realized that he was truly heartbroken. She decided to sit on the bench for a little while longer to give the guy time to calm down. Evening was slowly descending on the city. The sun was disappearing behind the horizon, painting the sky in bright shades of red, orange, and purple. The sky gradually darkened, and stars appeared. It started to rain, and the first drops fell to the ground. Gradually, the rain intensified, and within a few minutes, there was a heavy downpour. Then Sena decided to remind Dion that he was sitting at her doorstep and ask him to clear the way. The guy, all wet, looked at the stranger with tears in his eyes. Seeing the guy's silver hair and blue eyes up close, the girl drowned in his beauty. However, she suddenly remembered the conversations in society about a man with the same physical characteristics, whose name was Dion Fravel. Hearing his name from the lips of an unknown girl, the guy asked if she knew him. Avoiding the answer, she asked a counter question about what such an important person was doing on her doorstep. Standing in front of the guy, she remembered the first time she heard this man's name. Then the other hunters told her that Dion was the eldest son of the head of their guild. When talking about him, the girls were extremely inspired and vied with each other to praise his appearance. It was from them that Sena learned that the eldest son of the Fravel family, who makes people fall in love with him at first sight, has silver hair and blue eyes. At that time, the heroine did not believe these rumors. However, his friends insisted that the rumors were true and told more stories about him, saying that the leader did not allow him to join the guild because he had a terrible character. After hearing these stories, Sena assumed that Dion was a hothead. She also added that she would like to meet him someday. And now, in a stupor, she looked at the man about whom so many rumors were circulating. Now her boss's infamous son sat outside her door. Sena couldn't ignore him, since he was the son of the head of the guild where she worked. She then decided to lure him over to her side to regain her C rank. Seeing the stranger's thoughtful look, Dion stood up and asked if she wanted to tell him something. To please her boss's son, she apologized for the long pause with a forced smile. And with the same smile, she said that the whole thing was because the guy was standing in front of her house. As she spoke, she pointed her finger towards her doors. Turning around, he saw the doors to the house. He quickly asked for forgiveness and cleared the way. Sena accepted the apology with a smile and invited the boy into the house to take shelter from the rain. Dion was surprised by the stranger's behavior. The guy agreed with a smile and thanked him. When she came home, the girl invited him to sit down and lent him a towel. While the guy was waiting on the couch, the girl brought hot tea. At this time, Dion was wiping his face and hair with a towel. For Sena, this scene was truly beautiful. The girl's breath was taken away by such beauty. The boy took the cup gratefully. The girl put the tray on the table and thought that most likely her house looked too shabby for the guy. Taking her tea, the girl sat down on the sofa next to the guy and, looking at him, thought that he did not at all look like a person with a disgusting character. He didn't look like the bad guy rumored at all. Yet, she couldn't remember the boy with silver hair and blue eyes in the illustrations for the novel. Based on this, Sena assumed that Dion was a minor character. This means that he is nothing more than one of many who will ultimately fail to win the heart of the main character. While drinking tea, she continued to think that even the son of the guild leader was powerless against the plot of the book. The man was the first to break the silence. He once again thanked the girl for her help. The guy knew that the girl in the yard had seen everything, but Sena pretended not to understand what he was talking about. However, realizing that there was no point in denying it, the embarrassed girl awkwardly replied that she didn't want to bother them, and there was no need to worry about it. But the boy wanted to talk, so he asked Sena to listen to his story until the rain stopped. The heroine didn't consider it something difficult, so she agreed. Having heard the answer, Dion thanked him and began his story. The girl was very surprised to hear that Helen was Dion's childhood friend and also his first love. The reason for this was Helen's words that she and Dion had only known each other for a month. Then the guy clarified that Helen had reasons to think so. After all, she erased all her memories, including especially warm and bright moments spent with him when they came up with new games, participated in various adventures, and played pranks. And the motive for such a categorical decision was Helen's painful past, which haunted her. Ellen Evans is the main character of the world where Sena lives. Because she was the illegitimate child of Marquise Equils, she was bullied while growing up. Eventually, she decided to run away from home. However, she could not forget her painful past, so she found the witch and erased all her memories. Hearing this, Sena remembered that this was written in the background of the book he read in his past life. One day, when Dion was younger, he went to a ball and was all alone. The guy continued his story, and Ellen was the only person who approached him then. Since then, Dion could not forget her warm smile and gentle hands. At that time, he could not even imagine that such a kind girl suffered so much. And after learning that she erased her memories and ran away, the guy searched every corner of the capital to find her. And even the fact that she didn't remember him didn't matter. Then, having found her, Dion was sure that he could protect her and wanted to start all over again. But as time went on, more and more men came to confess to her, not counting the suspicious man who had been following her some time ago. Slightly agitated, Sena looked questioningly at her interlocutor. Dion then clarified that the man looked like an ordinary visitor, but was clearly of noble origin. Hearing about this, the girl suggested that perhaps the man was sent by Ellen's family and asked what the guy thought about it. Then Dion replied that he also allowed for such a possibility, since the people of the Euclid house were also looking for her, but he was concerned about the fact that at the moment there was no relationship between him and Helen, and therefore, if necessary, the guy would not be able to help her. Hearing these words, Sena understood that this was the reason for the sudden proposal of marriage, and in this way, Dion wanted to become a close person to Helen. In response, the guy simply nodded silently, thereby confirming the heroine's suspicions. Having finished his story, Dion noticed that the rain had already stopped and hastily said goodbye and headed for the door. As they parted, Sena tried to console the guy at least a little so that he wouldn't be so sad. She spoke words of encouragement with a smile. Finally, Dion smiled for the first time in all this time and, thanking the girl again, left. Only after her boss's son left was the girl able to relax a little. The day had been too tiring for her. After seeing the guest out, Sena decided to take a shower and go to bed. Suddenly, the girl realized that when he left, Dion called her by name. However, Sena clearly remembered that she did not say her name. Morning came to the city. The streets slowly woke up, filling with the noise of carriages and the voices of people. The heroine woke up from a terrible roar. Due to lack of sleep, the girl became furious, but she still had to get up. The angry girl went to check what was happening on the street. The door opened suddenly and hit the man standing behind it. The girl herself was frightened by the sudden blow and asked if the stranger was okay. The stranger greeted Sena and asked for forgiveness for standing in front of her door. Seeing the child in front of her, the heroine relaxed a little and asked about the reason for the noise, and also about the knights from the fancy carriage. Sena assumed that they had come to arrest someone. However, the stranger denied this guess and said that they were here because of the lady who owned the flower shop, as their master wanted to make her his personal gardener. The heroine could not understand why a noble man would want to hire an ordinary flower shop owner from a small town. Then she thought that perhaps this was the suspicious man Dion had spoken of. Tired of constantly thinking, Sena decided that it was time to put an end to these thoughts because they were useless. Having learned the reason for the noise, she said goodbye and hurried home. However, before she could close the door, some man pushed her away and burst into her home. Sena decided that the gentleman had simply mixed up the houses and warned him that he had the wrong door and that the flower shop was nearby. But the man seemed not to listen to her. Realizing that the stranger was not going to leave, the girl asked why he was breaking into her house, while the inspired knight asked his master if he had managed to make a deal with the owner of the flower shop. Without even listening to the end of his subordinate's question, the man sharply replied that Ellie had refused him and headed deeper into the house, looking around. Suddenly, he stopped and, turning around, said in a commanding tone that he wanted to buy Sena's house. While the girl stood in a stupor, he arrogantly ordered her to name the price. The stunned girl did not understand how she should react. Noticing the girl's confusion, the man with hair as black as night and eyes as scarlet as rubies decided to introduce himself in order to show his greatness. Hearing the name Rashid Karlman, Sena realized that the person standing in front of her was the Duke. The man, looking pleased, confirmed his status and asked again how much he would need to pay to buy the house. But the girl did not understand why the Duke needed such an old house if he already had an estate. However, even before receiving the answer, I understood the reason myself. There weren't many options. Most likely this was his plan to get closer to Helen. Such an act was too dubious, even for a high-ranking nobleman. Without waiting for a response from Sena, Rashid himself began to offer his own options based on the average cost of houses of this type. But the heroine did not let him finish and flatly refused to sell. Neither the Duke nor his assistant expected such an answer. The faithful knight could not tolerate such impudent behavior towards his master, and began to accuse the girl of violating etiquette. But Sena did not consider these words fair. Then the man moved from words to actions and drew his sword. But the D-rank hunter easily dodged the blow. She was not going to tolerate such an attitude towards her, so she warned that during the next attack, she would not stand there like a pillar and would fight back. To avoid a fight, the Duke gave the order to the knight to stop. At that moment, another knight who was standing near the door received another blow to the back of the head. Trying to enter the house, Dion opened the door and accidentally hit the guy. Dion apologized to him and greeted Sena with a charming smile. The girl wasn't expecting guests, so she asked in surprise what he was doing there. And the Duke obviously knew the guy and was not thrilled with him. Sena was taken aback when she learned that the two were acquainted. Of course, Dion was not happy about this meeting either. Rashid explained his presence by saying that he had come to buy the house. Then Sena, with a habitual smile, said that this was impossible, since he was the one who was going to buy it. This information once again shocked the girl. Ignoring the hostess of the house, the uninvited guests continued to argue about who would ultimately get the house and who would be able to pay more for it. After some time, Sena's patience snapped, and she screamed at the top of her voice for the guys to shut up. The enraged girl repeated once again that the house was not for sale. Even experienced knights were frightened by the huntress's evil expression. The girl suddenly developed a headache. Finally, the Duke realized that there was no point in trying to negotiate the purchase of the house at this point. In order not to waste his time, he and his men left Sena's estate. The heroine was pleased with this, but she also realized that Rashid would return. Dion thought so too. After the Duke left, the boss's son said that he wanted to ask something. But before he could ask his question, the girl suddenly fell down. Luckily, the guy managed to catch her, and she didn't hit the floor. All these nerves made Sena's head hurt terribly. The guy immediately called a doctor. After examining the patient, the doctor concluded that it was a common cold and that she would feel better after a little rest. The girl was surprised, as she had never been sick before, but the doctor said that there was nothing strange about it. Anyone could get sick one day. Since Sena was in the hospital a few days ago, before leaving, the doctor asked the man to take care of his wife, which stunned the unmarried couple. They didn't even have time to clear up the misunderstanding before the doctor had already left the house. Whether from the heat or from embarrassment, Sena's face turned red as a tomato. After the doctor's words, the guy also fell out of reality. Sena sat down on the sofa and sincerely thanked him for his help and for calling the doctor. Dion explained his sudden appearance by saying that he came to see Ellen, but then he heard a noise and decided to check what was going on. Then the girl happily replied that she was glad that the guy showed up on time. But the guy apologized because he felt guilty that because of him, the girl got wet in the rain, and most likely that was why she caught a cold. Sena was touched by Dion's concern, and the young man's guilty face completely amazed the girl. In response, Sena said that she did not blame Dion for this, but on the contrary, she was grateful to him for helping her get rid of Duke Carlman. Hearing this, Dion quickly explained that he himself had no intention of buying the house, but simply wanted to help Sena. The girl felt relieved, because then she had really been surprised. Dion was glad that he could help. Having finished the conversation, the guy asked the heroine to go back to bed, and while she was recovering, he promised to look after the house, which surprised the girl very much, since she was sure that Dion was going to the neighbor. But the guy replied that it wasn't that important, and he would go there another time. Dion insistently asked the girl to get a good night's sleep and rest. Hearing that Sena wanted to ask something the next time they met, the guy happily agreed to answer any question. Sitting back down, the girl said that on the first day of their meeting, Dion called her by name. However, she was sure that she herself had not said her name. Then, making an extremely surprised face, the guy replied that the girl herself told him. But the girl was sure of the opposite. Then Dion, with a confident voice, reminded that on the day of their first meeting, Sena introduced herself. Hearing this, the girl was shocked, as she did not remember this, and the guy asked in surprise whether she had really forgotten. Dion's words rang true, so the girl doubted her memory. Moreover, the guy had no reason to lie about something like that. Suddenly, Sena remembered something else, namely, their previous conversation about the suspicious man, and she decided to clarify whether that man was Duke Carlman. When she heard the negative answer, she was extremely stunned, as she was almost sure that it was Rashid. Dion then explained that the man also had dark hair, but it was longer and seemed to be purple in color. After hearing this, she was completely convinced that the pursuer was not the Duke. Then they began to think together about who that stalker really was. Suddenly, the girl realized that she was not in a state to worry about her neighbor. She should worry about herself first and foremost, because Duke Carlman said he would return. Then she said firmly that next time if the Duke talked about buying the house, she would fight back. Dion asked how exactly. Then the girl began to think about possible options. And the first thing that came to her mind was to beat Rashid. And realizing that she would then be arrested, she decided to do it when there were no witnesses. What she heard left Diona in shock, and a moment later, his face lit up with a radiant smile, and he answered with a laugh that the idea was not bad. A few hours later, having made sure that everything was fine with the girl, the guy asked for leave and left. It was already evening outside, and the sky was painted in bright sunset colors. After making sure Sena had closed the door, Dion turned away and left. As he walked, he thought that technically he had not lied to the girl when he said that she had given him her name at their first meeting. At this time, Ellen was busy with flowers in her shop. Looking at the delicate flowers, she thought of Duke Carlman. At first, when she saw the aristocrat surrounded by knights, she was frightened. However, the beauty and gentle tone of the guy with whom he asked to become his gardener won her over. He looked at her as a specialist, not a girl. Ellen was glad that such a high-ranking person appreciated her skills, but she felt that she was not fit to be a gardener at his lordship's estate. For this reason, she was forced to refuse the Duke. She told her friend about this during tea drinking. After listening carefully to the girl, the mysterious friend suggested that perhaps this man really did love Ellen. From these words, the girl's eyes dropped slightly. Her gaze was directed downwards. Her cheeks became bright pink from the rush of blood, and her lips were slightly pursed. The embarrassed girl did not believe that this was possible, but it gave her butterflies in her stomach. While Ellen was lost in her loving thoughts, Sena noticed her and came over to say hello. Sena said she would like to buy some white flowers. Ellen ran up to her neighbor in high spirits. The girl's glowing face was impossible not to notice, so Sena decided to ask the reason for such happiness. Helen enthusiastically shared her joy with her neighbor, telling him that yesterday a man of noble birth came to her and asked her to become his gardener. Reina stank with confusion, not understanding the reason for such admiration. The girl then added that it was the first time someone paid attention to her skills, and not her appearance. Sena immediately understood who they were talking about, and was unpleasantly surprised by this fact, since she did not expect such a reaction, and did not think that her neighbor could develop feelings for the Duke. However, Ellen, with a slightly upset voice, finished her story, saying that she had to refuse, as she was not sure that she could handle such a responsible job. She suddenly remembered that Sena had come for flowers, and ran to the shop to choose white flowers. Looking at the variety of light-colored flowers, Ellen thought about which ones to choose. Sena did not have the best opinion of the Duke, because she was worried that he might still come back and persuade Ellen, especially since the neighbor was already half conquered by him. At the same time, Sena was on Dion's side and didn't want to see him upset again. For this reason, she decided to intervene in this story. Sena turned on all her acting skills and said with a depressed look that something had happened that was really worrying her. Hearing about this, as expected, good-natured Ellen asked what had happened. Continuing her game, Sana pretended not to know whether to tell her neighbor about this, but she didn't have to be persuaded for long. She leaned over to Ellen and began to whisper in her ear in a sly voice, telling her that someone had broken into her house yesterday. Moving a little further, she clarified that it was Duke Carlman with his men. Then, in all the colors, with a little exaggeration, she told how the terrible Duke demanded that she sell him her house. Hearing how aggressively Rashid had behaved, and that he had even threatened Sana, Ellen turned pale with fear. Then the girl took Ellen's hand with a friendly smile and said in a worried voice that she could stand up for herself, so there was no need to worry. However, she herself is worried about her neighbor, as she believes that his lordship needs the houses in this area, and it also seems to her that the Duke enjoys torturing those who refused him. The naive girl took everything Sana said at face value and was horrified, not understanding how a man could do such a thing. Now all the Duke's actions and words seemed suspicious. Ellen realized with horror that all the Duke's actions were just a ploy to get her house. After her colorful story, Sana watched her neighbor's reaction. Ellen was completely disappointed by the Duke's treachery. Then Sana continued to add fuel to the fire. She said, in a sympathetic tone, that since she was a hunter herself, she was able to keep the land. But Ellen was more vulnerable. She advised her to be careful and try not to get involved with him. At the end of the conversation, she insistently asked to simply ignore the Duke completely. Ellen, horrified by all she had heard, agreed with her neighbor and thanked her, saying that she would be wary of him in the future. Hearing the much-desired words from Ellen and being pleased with her reaction, Sana replied with a friendly smile that no thanks were needed, since that was what neighbors were for. Having completely destroyed the image of Duke Carlman, the heroine was proud of herself. The next day, she excitedly told Dion about it. Hearing the girl's story, he was surprised and decided to ask her again if this meant that she had deliberately put the Duke in a bad light in front of Ellen. But Sana sharply replied that this was not so. She explained that it was just a normal conversation between neighbors, and that Ellen had taken it that way because of her upbringing. She also added that everything she said was based on irrefutable facts. Then Dion asked what she would do if the Duke found out about this. But Sana didn't even listen to him. Noticing that Ellen had left the house, she became inspired, and with a bright smile, sparkling eyes, and slightly pink cheeks, she told Dion to at least go and greet her. But before she could finish speaking, her neighbor came back in. Then, to console the seemingly upset Dion, Sana said that next time everything would work out. But the guy only felt awkward. Sana interpreted such a confused expression on his face as depression due to the previously received refusal. She smiled with all sincerity and promised to help him. Suddenly, Dion put his hand on the girl's forehead, and it turned out that she still had a fever, but she didn't even notice. Dion, with a worried voice, told her not to do that again, but the heroine did not understand what he was talking about. Then the guy clarified that he meant that Sana should not get in the Duke's way, just to help him. And, with a dazzling smile, Dion added that he had decided to let Ellen go. As the girl walked home, she continued to think about the words of her boss's son, and did not understand how this was possible. After all, he said that he had been in love with Ellen all his life. She wondered how he could give up so easily, and was worried that he would cry alone again. Sana remembered Dion's crying face when they first met. She was afraid that perhaps right now he was somewhere crying loudly. Continuing to immerse herself in her disturbing fantasies, she imagined how Dion, not noticing anything in front of him because of the tears flowing over his unrequited love, might run into bandits, who, having noticed his noble appearance, will want to rob the guy. But the cute and timid guy won't be able to fight back. Sana was horrified, just imagining what this could hypothetically be. She immediately rushed towards the guy to catch up with him and make sure he was okay. Suddenly, she heard screams and immediately assumed that it could be Dion. Mentally scolding herself for leaving her friend alone in such a dangerous area, she ran towards the voices to help him. However, the one lying on the floor was not Dion at all. And the one who contributed to this was our good-natured Dion, his silver hair shimmering and glowing as if it had absorbed all the moonlight. The girl decided to hide around the corner and watch what was happening, as she did not understand what was happening. The arrogant gentleman took out his anger on a gang of bandits who were unfortunate enough to encounter him. Suddenly, the boy felt the presence of a stranger, and in an arrogant tone, ordered him to stop hiding and come out, which frightened Sena very much, as she thought that these words were directed at her. Dion's next phrase shocked her completely, since he said that the wall would not be able to hide the observer's body, while the girl, although she considered herself to be large, was not so large as to deserve such words. While Sena was dumbfounded and didn't know what to do, a man with his hands raised came out from around the other corner. His name was Turner, and it was to him that Dion had been addressing all this time. When his friend asked him why he had been hiding all this time, Turner told him that he looked too scary and asked him in return if the man on the floor was alive, to which Dion replied with a sinister smile that he was, as he was sure that the guy could take care of it. Hearing these words, the street robbers, gathering all their strength, stood up and ran away in terror. Watching them go, Dion arrogantly said that he did not understand why they ran away, since they would die anyway, and Turner suddenly informed him that his superiors had contacted him and asked if Dion was really busy with the investigation. Then Dion slightly put his arm around his friend's shoulders and pulled him towards himself, with a cold smile asking if Turner was really going to report that he was loafing around, to which the frightened guy gave an immediate negative answer. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by a girl who looked like a teenager, dressed in a black cape that almost completely hid her face, and two chestnut pigtails peeked out from under the hood. She called the guys, and they immediately followed her. From shock and fear, Sena staggered, and unable to stay on her legs, which buckled from fear, fell to the ground. She was confused to learn that the bandit was the real Dion. At this time, Dion and his friends were going somewhere. Suddenly, the girl turned to him and asked what happened, because in her opinion, the guy didn't look very good. Receiving no answer, she asked again what he was worried about, since they had already tracked down Ellen. Dion finally responded, only saying that that wasn't the problem. Then, the girl smirked and suggested that it was because of Sena Row Hill. The expression on his face was more eloquent than any answer. The girl immediately realized that these two had finally met. At this time, Sena was still trying to digest the information she had received. The next day, the heroine headed to the guild, which, as always, was full of people. While waiting for her turn, she was still thinking about yesterday's events. After all, Dion back then was completely different from the Dion she was used to. Moreover, after hearing Turner's words, she still didn't understand what kind of management they were talking about. Since he was the son of the leader, the girl assumed that he could very well be a secret agent of the guild, or something like that. While the heroine was immersed in her thoughts, she did not notice how her turn had come. And only when she heard the administrator's call did she come to her senses and run up to the counter. The administrator happily greeted the huntress. Sena greeted him back and said that she was also glad to meet him. Assuming that the heroine had come for a new job, Anna quickly began to check the order lists, but the girl stopped her, saying that she had come to find out something. Having said this, Sena approached the curious receptionist and asked in a quiet voice about Dion Fravel. Since he was the son of the guild leader, Anna naturally knew about him, so Sena asked him to tell her everything he knew. The first thing the administrator thought was that he was a hot but crazy idiot. She went on to say that Dion was the son of the chief's first wife, but it seemed that the chief's brothers and sisters had caused that wife a lot of trouble. The main reason for this attitude was her ignoble origin. She eventually died quite early, and according to rumors, she died because the head's relatives abused her, Little Dion probably thought the same, because he began to take revenge on them. Rumor has it that Dion stole the bride of the chief's younger brother, Salon Fravel. According to the same stories, the engagement of the headman's younger sister, Isabella Fravel, was also disrupted by Dion, because he took her fiancé away. And it is because of these rumors that people consider him a crazy idiot. Sena was completely taken aback by what she heard. She didn't understand whether they were even talking about the same person. Anna concluded his story by saying that it would be better for the heroine not to get involved with him. Hearing Sena's last words, she panicked, as she didn't know that Anna would see through her so easily. But the administrator was quite smart, and immediately realized that Sena would not have come all this way out of idle curiosity. So the conclusion was obvious. She had encountered him somewhere. Anna didn't try to get any details out of her, but simply strongly advised her to stay away from him, as he really was a dangerous person. Sena thanked her for the advice and said goodbye to Anna, asking her to let her know if there were any interesting orders. As usual, there were many hunters in the room, but one of them stood out in particular. Anna immediately noticed the newcomer and showed him to Sena. The girl looked in the direction the administrator was pointing and saw the Duke. The heroine did not expect to meet him here and tried with all her might to hide her face so that he would not notice her. She quickly said goodbye to Anna and ran to the exit to leave as quickly as possible. All this time she continued to cover her face with her hair in order to somehow hide from the Duke. Because of this, she did not notice the person standing in front and accidentally crashed into him. Realizing the extent of her guilt, she immediately apologized. But the impudent hunter was not in the mood for polite conversation. Sena still didn't want to attract unnecessary attention and tried to answer as politely as possible. But Marcel seemed to be deliberately trying to provoke her. However, it was more important for Sena to get out of here as quickly as possible, so she endured with all her might in order to finish quickly and run away. But this made the guys even more brazen, and each time their words became ruder. Not only did they mock her, but they also brought someone close to her into the conversation. The hunters spoke rudely of Sena and ridiculed her father's death. She couldn't stand it any longer and said in a sharp tone that her father was alive. Then Marcel laughed even louder, saying that it was impossible. But Sena didn't listen to the rest of the mockery, and with a terrifying smile, asked why the guys started talking to her every time they met, since they weren't even friends, emphasizing that this is very impudent on the part of Marcel. And finally, she decided to return all his insults to the guy, telling him to brush his teeth because his mouth stinks, and that is why all the girls refuse him. This made the guy furious. Then Marcel was the first to show aggression and grabbed the girl by the chest. He furiously shouted at her, ordering her to shut up. But Sena was calm. She continued to laugh arrogantly in the guy's face, as she was confident in her abilities. Then Marcel lost control of himself and tried to hit her. Sena had no intention of dodging the attack, as everything was going exactly as she had planned. Because if the guy hit her first, then all her further blows would be considered self-defense. But someone grabbed the guy's hand and stopped the attack. He arrogantly pointed out Marcel's injustice and cowardice. The most surprising thing was that none other than Duke Carlman stood up to defend Sena. The hunter became even more angry. He tried with all his might to free his hand and demanded that he be let go. But Rashid indifferently ordered him to stop leading himself like that, since he could barely hold it up as it was. Having said this, he threw Marcel aside. The hunter fell flat on the floor. With his face distorted with anger, he shouted furiously that he would not let this go. Rashid, with a sarcastic smile, answered Marcel that he was just small fry. Sena watched all this in a stupor. Having finished his conversation with the hunter, the Duke immediately switched to gentleman mode and, approaching the girl, asked if everything was okay with her. The heroine didn't understand what was going on at all. She replied with an awkward smile that she was fine and thanked him for his help, mentally grieving that her perfect plan for self-defense had collapsed. At first, the Duke did not believe it and wanted to ask again, but suddenly he realized that the mistress of that house was standing in front of him. While they were talking, Marcel gathered his strength and attacked Rashid from behind. Sena noticed this in time and managed to warn Duke Carlman. Thanks to this, he turned around in time and blocked the blow. Having stopped the attack, the Duke continued to comment on Marcel's actions. Each of his words provoked the guy even more. Finally, the hunter drew his dagger. Noticing that he was about to attack an unarmed man with a knife, Sena could no longer stay away. She knocked the weapon out of his hands with one clear kick. After that, the Duke knocked the guy out. From the force of the blow, Marcel flew back several meters. Sena was happy that this idiot got it in time. Upon learning of the fight, the knights responsible for security within the guild came running. Seeing the hunters lying on the floor, they decided to arrest those responsible for this. Thus, Sena ended up behind bars. The worst thing was that the guards ran up just when they were delivering the blows. If the girl had also been injured, they could have tried to negotiate. And also, because the Duke was unguarded, he was not recognized and was locked up together with the heroine. The girl, out of politeness, asked if the Duke was okay and offered him a snack. However, he refused, saying that his assistant would come for him soon. Unexpectedly, he apologized to Sena for that incident, which surprised her greatly. He explained that he apologized for breaking into her house without permission and also promised to punish Gerd. Sena didn't know who he was, but from the context, she realized that he was the knight who attacked her. Rashid explained that the knight was a lazybones who had never received proper training and remained in his position only because his father was a loyal vassal of the Duke's family. The girl accepted the apology and said that everything was fine. She was still in shock from what had happened. Sena believed that most nobles would have reacted differently in such a situation. For example, directing their anger at her, or they would continue to yell furiously at the guards to let them out. As an example, she recalled the behavior of Marcel, whose family, although noble solely because of the title, behaves as if he is allowed to do anything. Analyzing this whole situation, she came to the conclusion that the Duke was a strange person. 3 hours later, no one had come for Rashid. The girl was extremely surprised by this. She then suggested that the reason for such a delay could be that something had happened to the assistant. When the Duke asked what exactly, she could not clearly answer. By doing this, she increased the man's mistrust and wariness. The atmosphere was extremely tense. Sena didn't know what she should say in such a situation. Then she suggested that they come up with something, since they were in the same boat. The heroine's last phrase greatly surprised the Duke. Sena couldn't think of anything better to do than to inform the warden that the man next to her was of noble birth. But, as expected, they didn't believe her. Suddenly she heard someone's footsteps, and the girl was delighted, thinking that it could be the Duke's assistant. But it was not him. The man said that he had come to see Sena Rohill. However, neither the Duke nor the heroine knew who it was. The stranger introduced himself as the butler of young Master Marcel and said that he had come on his behalf to request compensation in the amount of 1,000,000 rupees. The girl was simply shocked by such a sum. The butler began to explain that this amount took into account today's damage, as well as other damage that had been done earlier, adding that Sena's father had killed the young master's teacher. The girl became furious at these words, and without letting him finish, corrected him, saying that it was nothing more than an accident during service. Hearing these words, the Duke also asked what they were talking about. As it turned out, Aliyah Asl, Marcel's teacher, was killed while carrying out an order from Sena's father, so the butler and the young master considered him to be the culprit of the teacher's death. However, Sena insisted that Asl agreed to the order as a hunter. But for the vile butler, it didn't matter. He just wanted to receive huge compensation. Suddenly, he added with a sly grin that he had one more requirement. The condition was that if her comrade agreed to be tied up and beaten by Marcel, then there would be no need to pay. And if he knelt down right now, he could avoid 1 or 2 blows. At that moment the Duke's assistant burst in. The girl immediately informed him that his lordship was locked in a wretched cell. The assistant immediately ran up to his master and excitedly began asking what happened and how. Seeing this, the butler and the warden realized that he was indeed a duke. Sena, not missing the opportunity, told in detail about Marcel's desire to beat the duke. Hearing this, the butler turned pale with fear, and the observer tactically retreated. The man panicked and tried to come up with some kind of worthy excuse, but the assistant was furious. After some time, they sat down at the negotiating table. The Duke called Aaron, and he immediately came over. The butler and the guard trembled with fear, awaiting their sentence. When the Duke asked what he had asked for, the assistant answered in one breath that the master had ordered that he not be looked for or disturbed when he decided to take a walk alone. But the Duke clarified that he was talking about a different request. Then Aaron replied that he was almost finished with this matter. However, he suggested first dealing with the vile types who dared to insult the Duke. The frightened elderly man, barely able to put together a few words, tried to greet the gentleman correctly, as required by etiquette. But Rashid interrupted him and said that he wanted to meet Marcel personally. The Duke, with a haughty expression on his face, recalled everything that the butler himself had said and added that he wanted to personally check what condition he was in. But the butler could not allow this. Then Aaron asked about compensation. The man immediately replied that they had nothing to worry about. However, the assistant could not end everything so simply. He asked about his young master's desire to beat the Duke. Upon hearing this, the butler immediately began to deny everything and shifted all responsibility to Sena, saying that she alone should pay compensation. This caused bewilderment and anger in the heroine. She disagreed with the charges and believed that she was not obligated to pay anything. Suddenly, the Duke interrupted their argument, saying that he would pay on Sena's behalf. The girl looked at the Duke and did not understand what he was trying to achieve. The butler wanted to get money from the heroine. However, seeing the Duke's look, he did not dare to object and agreed to accept the money from him. But Sena didn't agree with this. The Duke was the last person she wanted to be indebted to. She already imagined how Rashid would force her to sell the house to pay off the debt, and she firmly said that she would never borrow from him. Besides, she did not agree with such a sum, so she asked the butler in a commanding tone to take her to Marcel so that she could see with her own eyes what condition he was in. She did not accept refusals from the butler and said that if he did not agree, she would go to Marcel herself. Sena stood up from her seat and headed towards the exit. The butler immediately rushed after her and stopped her. While they were arguing, the Duke suddenly spoke. He turned to Sena with a disappointed expression, reminding her of her own phrase about how, as cellmates, they were in the same boat. The girl was speechless. She didn't know what to answer, because these were really her words. The assistant was surprised by his master's behavior. He asked him worriedly if he was feeling okay. The Duke ordered Aaron to calm down. They eventually settled on 600,000 rupees, but the girl was confident that Marcel was fine. And the worst thing for her was that the Duke paid. She was worried about her home, so she turned sharply to the Duke and said that she would not sell the house. But Rashid didn't understand what they were talking about. Then Sena clarified that she was talking about her house and that she would never sell it to the Duke. Hearing the Duke's answer that she should not sell it, the girl was speechless. The Duke repeated her words once more and added that there was no need to worry about it. And when asked about the reason for such an act, he replied that he only wanted to make amends for his past misdeed. He also promised not to approach her again with requests to buy a house. The girl didn't expect this. She couldn't believe that the Duke gave her money just like that. Having finished the conversation, Rashid asked questions and left. Then Sena realized that the Duke was just walking her home. Watching the guy leave, she couldn't understand what all this meant. The next day, she woke up again from the noise. The sounds were coming from right under her windows. She went to the window to check. There was a crush in front of Ellen's house. Seeing the police there, Sena became worried about her neighbor. She immediately got ready and ran out of the house. She ran as fast as she could to get to Ellen as quickly as possible. But there were a lot of people near her house. They discussed that something terrible had happened. Then, in a panic, she grabbed one of the women and asked what had happened in the flower shop. The woman replied that a thief had broken into the house. Suddenly, someone's frightened cry was heard, and someone said that there was blood. These words took the heroine's breath away. Someone was being carried on a stretcher, and there really was blood there. Sena was horrified. She was already imagining the worst. The heroine ran up to the police officers, who were carrying the stretcher, but she was stopped immediately. However, she pushed the policeman away and rushed forward. Approaching the stretcher, she pulled the white cloth from underneath. One of the policemen was lying on a stretcher with a wound to his head. The girl was shocked, as she was sure that Ellen was there. A little later, while she was drinking tea with Ellen, she laughed at her for a long time. Sena mumbled sheepishly, justifying her feelings. Then the neighbor said with a smile that she was safe and sound. However, the heroine still did not understand what all the commotion was about in the morning. Ellen said the man on the stretcher was one of the police officers who came to her after she filed the report. But when he entered the house, he slipped on the water that the girl had spilled and injured himself. And because he was displaced by the fall that started this commotion, his face was covered. This utterly ridiculous situation seemed ridiculously absurd to the girl. After finishing her tea, Sena asked if they had managed to catch the thief in the end. But unfortunately, Ellen replied that the thief had managed to escape through the window before the police arrived. She laughed and said that the robbers most likely fled because they realized that she had nothing to steal. In any case, the heroine was glad that everything was fine with her neighbor. Ellen also said with a smile that she was lucky, as it would have been more dangerous if the criminals had broken into her bedroom while she was sleeping. Suddenly, Sena wondered if this episode with the thieves was in the original story. Then she began to think about how things would have turned out if she had then agreed to sell her house to the Duke. Sena suggested that in such a case, when the intruders broke into Ellen's house with the intention of stealing, for Ellen, it would have been enough to scream at the top of her voice, and the Duke would have come running at that very second to save her. Then he would have been able to win Ellen's heart right away. Sena vividly presented the scene where the Duke saves Ellen with a gentle smile, and the girl looks at him with loving eyes. Having imagined this, the heroine was glad that she had not sold the house. Seeing her neighbor's worried face, Ellen thought that she was still worried about her and hastened to reassure her, saying that she was indeed okay, especially since she initially knew that this was not the safest area. Sena herself knew that it was gloomy there. Suddenly, she realized that it was in the unfortunate areas that most incidents occurred. In other words, this was the ideal location for the main character, since in such a place, all sorts of troubles would always await her. Once she realized this, she also realized that Ellen could be in danger if she continued to interfere with the main male characters. She was worried about whether Dion would be able to protect Ellen on her own. Suddenly, Helen gently grabbed Sena's hand and said with a sincere smile that she was glad that her neighbor was next to her. Sena was embarrassed by these words. Ellen then added that other neighbors had come to visit her earlier. It was a real joy for her to be surrounded by such kind people. Hearing this, Sena felt relieved. However, she suddenly felt someone's presence and hurried to say goodbye to her neighbor to go check. Ellen was surprised by such suddenness. In order not to make her worry, Sena lied that she remembered an urgent matter, and that was why she was in such a hurry. Finally, she reminded her neighbor to always lock the door and left. Ellen said goodbye to her neighbor with a smile. After Sena left, Ellen continued to admire her kindness. Once outside the door, the heroine rushed after the suspicious man who was watching her and Ellen. The stranger immediately noticed that she was being chased and ran away. But Sena almost caught up with her and asked who he was. She picked up speed to grab him. Using her superior skills, the girl managed to catch up with the stranger in one jump. She landed right in front of him, Sena easily overpowered her pursuer. The criminal screamed that it was painful and tried with all his might to free himself from the grip. The girl demanded to answer the question of who he was. The guy shouted that it was him, but the girl did not understand who he was talking about and why he was pursuing Ellen. Then the man said his name, Aaron. Sena didn't remember him right away. The assistant was extremely surprised by this, since they had only seen each other yesterday. After these words, she began to remember something. Suddenly, she realized who it was. Realizing that it was the Duke's assistant, she jumped in surprise. Recognizing Aaron, she let him go, and they went to the Duke's recently acquired house, which was located near Ellen's house. Aaron was the first to speak. He hastened to explain, saying that he was neither a stalker nor a thief. Not knowing what to answer, she just smiled awkwardly. Aaron then added that yesterday they were the ones who chased away the thief and alerted the police. Hearing this, the girl understood the reason why the robbers ran away so quickly. The Duke's assistant said that when the criminals saw them, they became very frightened and ran away. He was incredibly proud of his master and himself. Then the girl, interrupting Aaron's heated speech, pointed out that what the assistant was presenting as supervision and protection of Ellen was in fact nothing more than surveillance and persecution. When the girl suggested that the Duke was following Ellen, the assistant frantically replied that his master was not that kind of person, and that Sena had misunderstood everything. Aaron tried his best to justify his master's actions, explaining that Lady Ellen was very important to the Duke, which is why he was trying to be there to protect her. However, the more the assistant chattered in panic, the more suspicious he seemed. In any case, Aaron was glad that the lady was safe and sound, but he still felt sorry because they didn't have a very good view. That is why they did not immediately realize that a thief had broken into the house. Understanding what Aaron was getting into, Sena immediately made it clear that she was not going to sell her house, once again emphasizing that he will never sell. Having finished the conversation, the heroine said goodbye and left. When she got home, she continued to play the meeting with her assistant over and over in her head. Everything seemed too strange to her. Moreover, during the story, the assistant often stuttered, which was also suspicious. After all, it is obvious that this is one of the signs of strong excitement. And besides, he never specified who the Duke is for Ellen. Looking out the window, she curses all the strange men who are chasing Ellen. From her house, there was a clear view not only of Ellen's house, but also of the Duke's house. He still had the light on, which meant he was keeping his men awake just to keep an eye on Ellen. Under these circumstances, it is difficult to believe that there are no ulterior motives. Suddenly, there was a scream, and the lights in the Duke's house went out. Hearing this, the girl became worried. As the voice was similar to Rashid's, she immediately grabbed her knife and rushed to help. No matter how suspicious the Duke's actions were, Sena couldn't just ignore her cellmate who paid her debt. When the girl reached the house, she noticed that it had become quieter again. Although she thought that perhaps she had come running in vain, she still decided to check. Oddly enough, the door was open, and she easily entered the house. There was a sweet aroma in the air. Suddenly, some sounds were heard again. This feeling was familiar to the heroine. She quickly began to look for something in her pockets. Taking out the device, she saw that the indicator was glowing red. However, remembering the Duke, she put the device back in her pocket and hurried to look for it. At last she found him, but the Duke was not himself. He was cornered in the corner of the room and shaking with fear. It was obvious that the man was not himself. He was having a panic attack. Covering his ears, he was trying to block out extraneous sounds. His mind was in a fog. He was muttering something, but his speech was incoherent and meaningless. Seeing this, Sena tried to bring his feelings, but her attempts were unsuccessful. The Duke simply did not perceive the surrounding reality. Then she resorted to extreme measures. After her blow, Rashid finally came to his senses. At first he was confused. Then he became furious. The girl is stunned to hear the guy's aggressive accusations that she did not warn him that the house was haunted. I calmed down a little. The guy continued to lament that if he had known about ghosts, he would never have stayed here all alone. To ease the tension a little, the heroine tried to laugh it off and suggested looking for the source of the sound. But the Duke was still frightened. He didn't want to deal with ghosts. Suddenly, the girl realized something. Seeing the guy's reaction, she realized that the Duke was afraid of ghosts. Blushing with embarrassment and anger, the man tried to refute these words, and the more he denied it, the less convincing he looked. Then Sena again suggested to the Duke that they find out together what the source of the sound was. The idea made the Duke shudder, but to prove his courage, he agreed with a face as pale as chalk. Having received a positive answer, Sena called the man to follow her. They walked together in the direction of the sound. Crossing the empty corridor, they reached some doors. While the Duke was terrified of what would be behind these doors, the girl boldly opened the door. At this time, the man tried to calm down and collect his thoughts. There was an empty room behind the door, but the guy didn't see this, because at the moment the girl opened the door, he turned away in panic. Noticing this, Sena decided to play a little joke. Realizing that there were no ghosts behind the door, the Duke finally opened his eyes. Realizing how terrible he looked, he began to tidy himself up. Avoiding eye contact, the Duke suggests checking the other room, as this one is empty. Sena immediately agreed and went forward, walking ahead. She could barely contain her laughter and still did not understand why the Duke did not order her to check everything alone and went with her, because it was obvious that he was afraid. Having reached the next room, the girl assumed that the sound was coming from there. Opening the door, they saw steps leading down. Then the Duke asked Sen in fear if she was really going to go down to the basement. The heroine decided to stop her mockery and suggested that he wait here while she checked everything herself. But the man was against it. He was worried that there might be something more terrible and dangerous than a ghost. Although his attempts to protect while he was trembling with fear looked ridiculous, his gallantry deserved respect. Sena tried to calm him down, reminding him that she was quite a strong hunter, but the Duke still thought it was not safe to go alone. Then the girl said that if something happened to her, he could get her house. The man was shocked by these words, because he had never even thought about such a thing. The Duke did not understand the reason for such thoughts. Realizing that the man was taking these words too seriously, Sena laughed and said that it was just a joke. Despite the guy's anger, the heroine had her own reasons for such a joke. But the Duke was furious, for everything has its time. And at the same time, this was exactly what the girl wanted, since in any case, being overcome with rage is better than shaking with fear. Be that as it may, the girl suggested that the guy wait, and she went to check the basement. The further she walked, the darker it became. The girl could hardly see anything. She was lucky because she had a mana stone. Lighting her way with a Mano stone, she reached the door, but by that time the noise had already stopped. Noticing this, the Duke hastened to suggest returning, since the sounds had stopped, which meant that everything was now in order. But Sena was adamant. She walked forward bravely, and the Duke followed behind, still trying to dissuade the girl from this idea. Sena was already irritated by his constant persuasion. She jerked her hand away and angrily ordered him to let her go. The guy was confused and scared at the same time. Seeing such an expression on his lordship's face, Sena could not hold back her laughter and began to laugh loudly. Looking at the Duke's red face, it was hard to believe that he was called a ferocious monster. Suddenly, Sena spoke in a serious tone. Looking straight into the man's eyes, she said that the thing below was not a ghost, and her phrase that it was a demon surprised the guy even more. Then, to prove her words, she showed him a device with a red stone in the center and explained that it reacts to demons. Putting the device back in her pocket, she continued, saying that the sweet aroma that filled the entire house was also proof. After listening to the girl, the Duke asked her how the demon managed to cross the capital's barrier. Sena herself did not know the answer to this question, but she had certain thoughts about what kind of demon they were dealing with. But before they could reach the source of the sound, some force pushed the girl down the stairs. Rashid tried to catch her. He pulled the girl towards him to stop her fall. As a result, she dropped the mana stone. And also losing their balance, they both fell backwards. While the guy was worriedly asking if Sena was okay, she didn't even understand what had happened and why the Duke had pulled her back so abruptly. The girl looked at the guy with stunned eyes, not understanding what was going on. Coming to her senses, she suddenly jumped up from her seat and asked what the Duke was doing. Then the man explained that although the unknown force was a simple gust of wind, there was no point in it because they were in a closed space with no windows. The girl ignored the Duke's concerns and moved on, deciding to first look for her mana stone. The stone rolled into the basement and lay next to the golden-haired girl. As Sena got closer, she noticed that the girl looked like a creepy version of Ellen. At first glance, she realized that this could not be her neighbor. Following the heroine, the Duke also entered the basement, and upon seeing the evil copy of the beautiful Ellen, he was terribly frightened. Sena immediately noticed the hint of fear on Rashid's face, and she couldn't miss such an excellent opportunity to make fun of the Duke. The heroine immediately turned on her acting talent and, pretending that her back hurt, asked the man to help lift the stone. The guy turned even paler at this request. He wanted to refuse with every fiber of his being, but he couldn't say no because of guilt. With shaking legs, he walked towards the mana stone. The girl was no longer able to hold back her laughter and began to laugh secretly. The Duke was so happy when he reached the stone that he didn't even notice that something was hovering in the air right above his head. Seeing this, the girl suddenly stopped laughing. Noticing this, the Duke became even more frightened and asked the heroine what had happened. Suddenly, this something approached the Duke and began to ask the same question over and over again about why the man killed him. The unknown thing looked like a ghost in black clothes. Bloody red marks appeared around, and suddenly, a ghost, with a creepy smile, abruptly descended, as if trying to get to the Duke. Realizing that Carlson was in a stupor, the girl called him to bring him out of his trance. Realizing that it was a demon, she immediately rushed towards the Duke. But the men were already having a panic attack. He was shaking with chilling horror, not noticing anything around him. With a trembling voice, he repeated that it was Serena. The demon with red eyes and a terrifyingly scary face continued to rapidly approach. Looking at the ghost again, Sena noticed that she had the same eye color as the Duke. The demon inspired fear and panic. But the situation was further aggravated by the fact that the ceiling was on the verge of collapse. Sena tried to get the Duke out of there. Having barely stepped over the threshold, they both fell to the floor. At that very second the ceiling collapsed. The Duke had already come to his senses a little, but he was still in a state of shock. Just outside the door, the demon, still in the form of a creepy woman, hung from the gallows. Her sinister laughter echoed in the basement. These sounds again caused the Duke to fall into a stupor. He repeated incessantly that he had not killed her. Coming closer, the girl put her hands on Rashid's shoulders and said in a calm voice that everything he was seeing now was unreal, just an illusion, so he didn't need to be afraid. Having achieved eye contact, she added with a smile that he just needed to close his eyes and wait a little. She would be back soon. The Duke still did not fully grasp reality. He remembered Serena, who was wearing a soft pink dress, her long hair fluttering beautifully in the wind. Suddenly, the boundaries between reality and fiction blurred. Thinking that the girl was still alive and continuing to call her, the Duke walked towards her. He walked with uncertain steps, but at the same time, he was glad that the girl was alive. He did not want to believe in her death. All this time, Serena didn't turn around once. Suddenly, the amplitude of her hair movement became sharper. Her hair seemed to get longer with every second. Suddenly, she turned around, and the fairy tale world collapsed in an instant. The girl with a terrible face and an ominous voice continued to blame the Duke for her death. The man continued to make excuses, repeating that it was not him. Unexpectedly, Sena returned with good news. She reported that she had caught the little demon and explained once again that everything the Duke had seen all this time was just an illusion. She held out her hand and showed off her catch, explaining that it was an avalakas, a rather rare species of demon. She described in detail how exactly these little pests operate, and how they obtain their victims' nightmares, and how they project them into the real world as an illusion. Remembering that these demons love to eat fingers the most, the girl quickly began to check the Duke's hands. Sena also added that the incident with the wind was also just a trick of these small creatures. The Duke, stunned, asked only one question: how did Sena manage to defeat the demon? The girl explained everything by saying that she is a hunter and specializes in demons that control the mind. The Duke still couldn't recover from the nightmare he had seen. Noticing his pale complexion and unnatural behavior, the worried heroine asked Rashida if everything was okay with him. Having replied that everything was fine, the Duke tried to get up. Suddenly, his face was right in front of Sena's nose. Only now did he notice the girl's kind smile. Only now, realizing that the heroine was not so aggressive, but on the contrary very kind and sweet, the Duke became embarrassed. Watching the Duke's reaction, Sena was puzzled, not understanding what he was thinking. However, since they had already caught the demon, the girl, standing up from the floor, suggested going back. She told the guy with a charming smile to take her hand and stand up. The Duke was enchanted by her. He agreed and took Sena's hand. As the morning approached, the townspeople began to discuss something heatedly. Some of the neighbors heard loud sounds. Some even thought it was an earthquake. But Sena hastened to calm them down, explaining that it was only the floor that had collapsed. And the reason for this was that the house was already old. This explanation suited the neighbors just fine. Hearing the rumors, a worried Ellen ran to the heroine to make sure she was okay. She was dismayed by the news that the floor had collapsed. Sena told her the same thing as the other neighbors. But suddenly, Ellen's expression changed, and she asked in a serious tone what Sena was doing in his lordship's house. Trying to come up with something on the fly, the heroine replied that she was helping with the move. Hearing this, Ellen, with her old smile, said that she was glad to know that Sena was not hurt. Having finished her conversation with the heroine, she glanced furtively towards the Duke. Suddenly their eyes met. Noticing this, Ellen bowed and said goodbye to her neighbor before leaving. Finally there was silence, and Sena breathed a sigh of relief. But before they had time to enjoy the peace, Aaron appeared out of nowhere, running as fast as he could towards his master. He asked worriedly what happened and how. In order not to tell the whole story from the very beginning, the Duke merely showed it to be examined, but the assistant did not understand what was being discussed. Then Rashid called Sena. The girl immediately understood what was being discussed and began looking for something in her pocket. She took out a small demon in the shape of a bee and handed it to Aaron. The Duke signaled to his assistant to take the demon away. Looking at the small thing in his hands, Aaron still had a lot of questions, but the Duke ordered him to return to the estate and examine it, and also to call a doctor. At first, Sena didn't understand why a doctor was needed, and when I realized it, I was shocked. The Duke personally cleaned her wound. This made the girl feel awkward, and she grabbed the towel, saying that she could handle it herself. The Duke continued to stare at her, but for Sena, such burns were common when working with mana stones. After all, she is one of those who is not subject to magic. When a person uses magic with the stone, once the mana runs out, the stone turns black. But Sena came up with his own way of using the mana stone. It causes the mana inside the stone to quickly leak out, and then uses it as explosives. Usually after an explosion, dust rises. However, the target can also be hit with one blow. This is a fairly effective way of hunting. Rubbing her hand, Sena continued to think about the demon she had recently captured, and the Duke watched her silently. He suddenly asked her if this happened to her often, and the girl calmly replied that yes, since she was a hunter. But what surprised Resida most was the phrase that Sena no longer owed him anything, because he did not understand what kind of debt they were talking about. Then the girl explained that she was talking about the day when the Duke helped her escape from prison. Then the Duke agreed with a smile, thanking him for saving him. He also added that from now on, the girl can count on his help. However, he was extremely surprised to hear a request to share with her the information that Aaron would find. And although he promised to fulfill any request, this time he refused. He could not name the reason for the refusal, but in return, he promised to fulfill any other request. The girl insisted on her own, arguing the need to obtain such information, but the Duke was adamant. However, Sena also didn't want to retreat, because a demon had appeared in the capital, and it was natural to worry about such a thing. But even this reason was not enough for Duke Carlman. Having received another refusal, the girl became seriously angry. Their conversation was interrupted by Aaron, who brought the doctor. However, before he could enter, he immediately noticed the oppressive and tense atmosphere between the two. This made the assistant and the doctor feel uncomfortable and awkward. They froze in place and did not know how to act in such circumstances. And hearing the girl's angry cry that everything was fine, they even flinched in fear. The Duke continued to maintain an imperturbable expression on his face, showing with his whole appearance that further arguments were pointless. After finishing the conversation, Sena still allowed the doctor to give her first aid. On the way home, she continued to think and analyze what had happened over the past couple of days. In particular, she was haunted by thoughts about the demon who had managed to cross the capital's barrier. Suddenly, she felt someone's presence right behind her. The heroine turned around sharply to check who it was, because the unknown person had managed to get so close unnoticed. But before she could even react, the stranger grabbed her wounded arm, causing her pain. Suddenly, an unknown person asked with concern in his voice if the girl was okay. As it turned out, it was Dion. However, for some reason, upon seeing him, the girl did not calm down, but on the contrary, felt a certain awkwardness. Scenes from that night came back to me. At some point, she even turned pale from worry. Dion, not knowing the reason for such a reaction, became even more alarmed, thinking that she was wounded. The girl continued to think that the man now looked completely different. It was as if they were two different people. Having collected her thoughts, Sena answered with an awkward smile that it was just a small problem. But the answer did not satisfy the guy. He was still worried and asked for details. Then the heroine remembered that Dion was the son of the guild leader and suggested that he might have heard something about demons. Taking advantage of the situation, she invited him for a conversation. They went to a restaurant to continue their conversation there. Sena showed with her whole appearance how much she enjoyed the food. Dion was pleased with this reaction. During dinner, they discussed the appearance of a demon in the capital. Unlike the Duke, Dion immediately agreed to share information if he found out anything. Looking at the guy's elegant behavior, Sena still couldn't figure out what happened that night and whether that arrogant man was Dion. Suddenly, Dion started talking about the Duke. He asked Sena not to help Rashid anymore and even better to stay away from him. But the heroine could not promise such a thing because the Duke is her neighbor and he had helped her before. She also said that the Duke was not so bad, and that his men had helped Ellen when thieves broke into her house. However, this was the first time Dion had heard about the incident with the thief. Then Sena told him everything, and added that there was nothing to worry about now because Ellen was fine. But suddenly Dion asked if she was okay. The heroine was surprised by such a question, because the thief broke into the neighbor's house, and not hers, and answered that, of course, she was also fine. When the girl asked if he was going to visit Ellen, Dion replied that he was not sure yet. However, he looked worried. Sena interpreted this expression as concern for Ellen, and was once again convinced of the genuineness of his feelings for Ellen. Continuing to live irritably, she thought that if all this really was pretense, then he was a brilliant actor. Suddenly, the man's expression changed. He offered the girl to eat his portion, which he had cut up in advance since she had injured her hand. The girl happily gobbled up the food and was touched by Dion's kindness. In the end, all that mattered to her was how the guy treated her, and it was okay even if he had another side. Dion watched Saini with joy. When the guy asked what she would do after lunch, the girl said that she would most likely go to the library to look for information about the demons that had appeared in the capital. Then the guy offered his help, but the girl hastened to refuse because she felt awkward relying on him so much. However, Dion reminded her with a dazzling smile that her arm was injured and she would most likely need his help. Sena agreed with him to some extent, so after some thought, she agreed. Having finished lunch, they came to the library. Sena walked ahead, and Dion followed, even though this was not part of her plan. Initially, she was going to question the guards. However, with Dion, she would have been very conspicuous. Besides, he could help Sena meet the mages from the Adventurers Guild in the future. With an evil grin, she made plans for the future. At the library, they were greeted by the administrator and asked to show their identification cards. Sena showed her D-rank hunter card. Dion also showed his document. The librarian was delighted with his beauty, but she quickly came to her senses and said that everything was in order with the documents, and they could proceed further. However, the girl addressed Dion by the name Russell Dar. Hearing this, Sena began to look suspiciously at the guy. The administrator, with a smile, showed where the books on the topic in question were. The heroine and Dion went in the indicated direction. As he walked past the shelves, the guy simply remained silent. At the same time, the girl was waiting for an explanation. With every silent step, her doubts only grew stronger. The girl's suspicions reached their peak. She came to the conclusion that Dion might be a fake. Feeling the guy's gaze on her, she turned in his direction. Under his gaze, she felt awkward and asked what was the matter. The heroine was shocked, thinking that Dion was going to reveal his true identity. The guy, after collecting his thoughts for a long time, said that he wanted to tell her the truth. The girl stood holding her breath, waiting for what the man would say. But suddenly, Dion blushed and said that he hated libraries with all his heart. Apparently, this was not the truth that Sena expected. Then Dion sheepishly explained that he could simply fall asleep while reading and asked the girl not to leave without him. The heroine was perplexed by such a request, but agreed. To ease the awkward atmosphere and keep the conversation going, Sena suggested that Dione wasn't particularly fond of books, to which the guy instantly responded that he simply hated them. Reina was extremely annoyed that Dion was taking this so seriously. Then the girl asked directly who Russell Durr was. The question was unexpected for the guy, and the girl, realizing that she had said too much, immediately covered her mouth with her hand, as if trying to take back the words she had already said. Realizing that he was talking about the hunter's ID that he showed, he calmly began to answer the question. He replied that the certificate was made by order of his father, and he himself did not know who this name belonged to. The girl was skeptical of the answer and asked a counter question about whether it wouldn't be easier to use her real name. Then Dion replied that the girl was of course right, but he was not registered as a hunter. The reason for this is that many people are wary of him, since he is the eldest son of the head. For the same reason, they don't want him to become a hunter. Sena hadn't even imagined this, but based on the fact that the father had created a fake ID for his son, she decided that the head really did care about him. But the guy wasn't sure about it. Then the heroine noticed that as soon as she mentioned the head, his mood immediately worsened. So she decided not to talk about the chapter anymore and start looking for the right book. But her arm hurt more than she thought. Noticing this, Dion helped her get the book she had chosen. At that moment he looked like a handsome prince from a fairy tale. Sena took the book and thanked him for his help. It was Elliot Raffman's work on telepathic demons. The heroine said that the scientist and writer had spent his entire life tracking down and studying demons, and was also the first to compile a bestiary of demons. She continued her story excitedly, saying that the demon she encountered in the basement the previous night was telepathic. After listening to the girl, Dion began to read the page on which the book was open. There, the author wrote about his experience of encountering a demoness, about how he froze in place, as if rooted to the spot when she used her spell. Dion continued reading the story out loud, and according to the narration, after that, she touched the scientist's lips with her tongue and began to slowly run her red nails along his thigh. But upon hearing this, Sena abruptly closed the book, not letting him finish the paragraph. The girl turned pale from shock, and only after she looked at the book again did she notice the subtitle that the book was devoted to the study of the seductive charms of succubi. She felt awkward, even looking in the man's direction. At the same time, Dion looked at her with a gentle and kind smile. While Sena's thoughts were all gone from embarrassment, and she stood in a stupor, the guy called her. To help the heroine relax, he praised the author, saying that most likely the scientist was dedicated to his work. Although Sena was still extremely confused, she still agreed with Dion's assumption. But she was still ashamed, so she covered her face with a book and asked the guy to sit and wait somewhere while she looked for information. Having said everything she was going to say and not waiting for an answer, she quickly ran away. Dion didn't even have time to react. Moving away from the guy, Sena began to mentally curse Elliot Raffman for the shame she had experienced. After all, she admired him so much, listening to stories about how the scientist risked his life in the name of science. And in the end, he dedicated his work to succubi, describing in detail and in all the details his encounters with them. Having come to her senses a little, the girl noticed that she had been holding the book tightly all this time. Realizing this, she realized that her previous actions may have created the wrong impression. This was a blow to her. The last thing she wanted was such misunderstandings. However, there was no point in worrying now, because the guy had already formed the wrong impression of her. So Sena decided to just start reading. After reading a couple of pages, the girl noticed that although the book was vulgar, there was also useful information. Moreover, the author has organized all the information well. After flipping through several pages, Sena found the one she needed. There was information about the demon she had captured. There wasn't that much information. According to the book, this demon is not typical for the area where the heroine lives and is not strong enough to break through the barrier of the capital. Based on this, the girl came to the conclusion that someone deliberately caught and released him there. Time flew by while reading. Having finished with the books, Sena decided it was time to go back, and only after she stood up did she notice that it was already sunset. She began to look around in search of Dion. Not finding him nearby, the girl ran in the direction where they had separated. Running between the shelves, she noticed a man in a cape. The stranger's purple hair caught her attention. She remembered Dion's story about the suspicious man who had been following Ellen. Then Sena assumed that this was the unknown person. While the heroine was watching him, the suspect quickly left somewhere. Following him, she saw that the stranger was entering the area with prohibited books. Then her fears grew even stronger. After all, there was a high probability that an unknown person was following Ellen with the intention of harming her. Therefore, in order to protect her neighbor, Sena began to keep an eye on the suspicious guy. But he just walked between the shelves. Since the use of magic was prohibited in the library, Sena was confident that if she had to fight him, she would definitely win. The stranger suddenly changed his direction. The girl followed, but suddenly the man began to return. Noticing this, Sena stopped. In order not to get caught, she also decided to turn back. But the steps were getting closer, and in a panic, looking around, the girl began to look for a secluded place. Since there was no time left, she decided to hide behind the shelves. But before she could run away, someone suddenly grabbed her hand. An unknown force pulled Sena towards itself. The frightened heroine resisted and tried to free herself. But hearing Dion's voice, she instantly calmed down. Looking back, she saw Dion standing behind him. The man asked to be quiet and said that he would explain everything later. Suddenly, an unfamiliar voice was heard. The purple-haired man addressed the middle-aged man as my lord. The Marquis informed the purple-haired boy that Duke Carlman had begun to suspect something and that they needed to find Ellen first. Looking at Marquis Equils, Sena slowly began to remember the beginning of the novel she had read in her past life. According to the plot, during her stay with the Marquis family, Ellen was subjected to many sufferings, and therefore she called all of them bad people, with the exception of the Marquis Ekvelis himself, since it was difficult to determine whether he was good or bad. The members of House Eklis treated her inhumanely because she was an illegitimate child. But despite the fact that everyone hated her, there was one person who provided her with a room, clothes, food, and maids. This was the Marquis of Achilles. However, he never visited Ellen. Unlike other family members, the Marquis seemed reluctant to acknowledge Ellen's existence. The other children beat her. They openly mocked her, but the adults didn't react at all. All this happened with the tacit consent of the head of the family. No matter how much his children and wife mocked Ellen, the Marquis never tried to stop them. But he never tried to make her situation worse. It was as if Ellen didn't exist for him at all. However, in that case, it was unclear to Sena why he decided to find Ellen now. At the same time, she became convinced that the man with purple hair was the one who had been following her neighbor. Suddenly, the Marquis asked an unexpected question. He asked about the girl from the flower shop, who looked very much like Ellen. And the purple-haired guy's answer was even more shocking. He said that the girl was definitely not Ellen. Sena was confused, but Dion reminded her to be quiet since they were still hiding. Then the guy explained his conclusions to the Marquis. He said that when they came for the first time, the girl was really very kind and nice, just like Ellen. But the second time, the girl attacked the purple-haired boy's subordinate and drove him away. But that wasn't the only reason he claimed the girl wasn't Ellen. After listening to him, the Marquis asked about the main reason for such a statement. Then the guy said that when they came for the third time, the girl drove them away in a rage. She furiously attacked them with a broom, cursing and calling them the most terrible names. Unable to listen to these vulgar words any longer, the noble gentleman ordered the story to be finished, since he had already heard enough. Sena and Dion were also taken aback by Ellen's behavior. The heroine remembered her recent conversation with her neighbor. Then she taught Ellen how to survive in this world. She told her that in order to live in this dangerous world, a girl needs to know a few bad words. Sena would say curse words and teach Ellen to repeat them when necessary. After listening to the purple-haired boy's story, the heroine realized that most of what Ellen said were words that she had taught her. However, among everything Ellen said, there were curse words that Sena had not taught. Seeing Sena's expression, Dion couldn't help but laugh. Then the heroine abruptly covered his mouth with her hand, warning him in a quiet voice not to make any noise, otherwise they would be caught. After the guy's words, the Marquis also became convinced that the girl was not Ellen, because she would not have expressed herself like that. The purple-haired guy, although he agreed with this, still said that he wanted to check everything again. But since Ellen had already seen him, he said he would disguise himself. At this point, the guy finished his report. After the two left, Dion laughed heartily and asked how Sen had even come up with the idea of teaching Ellen swear words. The heroine was surprised, not understanding how the guy found out about this, but he explained that Sena had it all written on her face. Then the girl explained that she had taught it only for the purpose of self-defense, so that Ellen could use it against the Duke and his men. And although the girl had used this knowledge under different circumstances, it still had an effect. These words made Dion even more cheerful. He also noted that it was undoubtedly effective. Then the embarrassed Sena said that since Dion liked everything so much, he should pay her. The guy liked this idea, and he rushed to look for his wallet. Seeing this, the heroine rushed to stop him, clarifying that she was just joking. Then Dion pretended not to understand this. However, a moment later, he laughed again, saying that he was also joking. Looking at the boy's carefree laughter, Sena remembered something. She asked if Dion was worried. Seeing the puzzled expression on her friend's face, the girl clarified that the point was that the Marquis was looking for Ellen and that he might try to get her back. But the guy wasn't particularly worried about it. Sana considered Dion's attitude too careless. Then, thinking that since Ellen lived next door, it would not be safe for her either if dangerous people were hanging around her neighbor, Sana decided that if it came to a fight, she would kill them all. After all, their actions could affect her home too. Dion, as before, watched the heroine with tenderness in his eyes. Noticing the guy's intent gaze, Sana asked why he was looking. But the man only replied that he simply felt at ease and had fun with her, which greatly surprised Sana. And when the heroine asked him what he was going to do after everything, Dion replied that he hadn't decided yet. The girl nodded automatically in response, but suddenly realizing, she asked in shock how he could not think about it and what about his feelings for Ellen. The girl was simply stunned by Dion's indifference. Having finished the conversation, the guy got up from the floor. He justified his behavior by saying that Ellen was safe with Sana and offered to take her home since they had already finished all their business in the library. The heroine looked at him and did not understand what was wrong with him. The guy, holding out his hand, waited for her answer. The next day, Sana decided to consult with the administrator at the guild. After listening to her friend, Anna assumed that either the guy no longer loved that girl, or he simply decided to forget everything and move on. The heroine still did not understand why the guy made such a decision. However, in order not to arouse suspicion, I decided to end the conversation there. Watching Sana's expression, Anna asked with a grin who they were talking about. The agitated heroine replied that he was talking about his friend, but the insightful administrator didn't believe it. Then the heroine decided to change the subject. She asked Anna if there was anyone from the investigative department in the department now. Hearing the question, the administrator began to check the documents. Having found the necessary document, she reported that at the moment, everyone had gone home. It looked very strange. So Sana immediately assumed that perhaps the Duke was deliberately preventing others from contacting this department. Anna also thought it was strange and said that perhaps there was some mistake in the documents. She suggested that her friend go up and wait there, saying that the department was on the 3rd floor. Standing at the door, the heroine doubted whether she should enter and assumed that perhaps the door was completely locked. However, the door opened easily. Looking at the open door, Sana was surprised that everything had happened so easily. The man sitting behind the door and checking some documents, seeing the girl, said that she had arrived earlier than he thought. Hearing this voice, Sana was discouraged. Dion sat in front of her, raising his azure eyes. He looked at the heroine with a smile and said that he had been waiting for her. Sana was extremely surprised to hear these words. Then Dion recalled that yesterday on the way home, the girl told him that she would go to the investigative department. After these words, Sana also remembered that conversation. However, the girl still did not understand how Dion was able to enter here at all, because usually if no one is there, the doors are locked. Getting up from his seat, the guy replied that he had opened the door himself, and taking the key to the lock out of his pocket, he showed it. Seeing someone else's name on the keys, the girl turned pale. But Dion, with his usual smile, said that he had stolen the keys from the magician of the operational search department. Having said this, he handed the keys to her. The girl was simply shocked by how calmly he told all this. At that moment, Sana thought that today, Dion would introduce himself as a crazy bastard. They began to rummage through documents and reports, searching for the necessary information. Along the way, the heroine asked the guy if there was anyone in the office when he arrived. Dion replied that there was no one. Then Sana began to worry about what would happen to the owner of the key if they found out about the break-in. After thinking for a bit, the guy replied that he would most likely get a scolding from his boss. Hearing this, the heroine felt guilty toward the stranger, who would most likely be punished because of them. That's why Dion suggested finishing quickly and leaving. But no matter how much they searched, they could not find a report about the demon that had entered the Duke's house. After searching everywhere, they came to the conclusion that the report had been hidden. Since the information was so secret, it was likely that even a direct question to the point would not have had any effect. so they decided to finish with the reports and come up with another way. Then Dion suggested to clean up and leave. In response, Sena asked if she could ask a question. Having received his consent, the heroine asked if he had really given up his feelings for Ellen. Hearing a positive answer, the girl opened her mouth in surprise. Dion added with a smile that he believed that Ellen would be better off with the Duke. Sena tried to console the guy by telling him that he was a wonderful person. And although she didn't say exactly what she thought, she still said many flattering words and said that he would definitely meet a wonderful person. Hearing the girl's kind words, gently touching Sena's hand, he asked her to make him feel better. At that moment, the guy's eyes were beautiful. His gaze was full of tenderness. Trying to at least answer something, the heroine said that she was not sure that she could make him laugh as much as she did yesterday. He didn't expect such an answer. Dion couldn't help but laugh. It brought him to tears. Seeing the guy's reaction, Sena became even more embarrassed and blushing. She asked what she should do to help then. Dion, still laughing, replied that it would be enough if she just stayed close. Based on the man's words, Sena decided that he meant that the girl should spend more time with him. And I came to the conclusion that Dion just needed a friend. Taking advantage of the opportunity, the man invited the girl to have a bite to eat. But the girl was busy looking for a job, so she was forced to refuse. Seeing Dion's depressed expression, the heroine tried to change the subject, but because of Dion's puppy-like appearance, Sena felt guilty. After some time, they tidied up the room. Everything was perfectly tidied up. It looked as if no one had been there. After finishing cleaning, Dion and Sena headed towards the exit. Suddenly, some steps were heard, and abruptly grabbing the guy, the heroine said that they needed to hide and wait until this man left. Having said this, Sena cautiously pressed Dion against the wall. The guy was embarrassed by such closeness, but the girl was focused on the steps. After some time, the footsteps died down, and she reported this to Dion. Realizing that they were safe, she breathed a sigh of relief and glared at Dion. Sena was angry that the guy was just trying to get out without thinking about the fact that they might get caught. Dion tried to justify himself by saying that in that case, they could have lied and said that they had come there on business. But the answer did not satisfy the girl. She was furious because it was obvious that no one would believe such nonsense. However, remembering that the person standing in front of her was her boss's son, Sena mentally calmed herself down. Coming closer, she asked as calmly as possible if Dion knew that she had quite an attractive appearance. She explained her words by describing the guy's appearance. His shiny silver hair, clear blue eyes, and devilishly attractive facial features, which stood out from the rest. And even that librarian was delighted with Russell Dower. Hearing such a high assessment of his appearance, the guy involuntarily laughed. This made Sena furious again, because she was talking about a serious topic. But the guy was glad to hear that the heroine considered him handsome. In any case, he promised to be more careful in the future. In return, he asked the girl to keep her promise and be there. Remembering their recent conversation, she agreed. Sena gave her word that she would try to keep her promise. The next morning, awakened by the knocking of doors, the sleepy heroine opened the door. A cheerful and happy Dion stood on the threshold. He happily invited the girl to dinner. The girl didn't think the guy would come so early, but considering it was already noon, Dion had no intention of going anywhere. He grabbed Sena's hand sharply and pulled her along with a smile. The next day, Dion came again, but this time an hour later. He promised with puppy eyes that this time he would not drag her along by force. And a day later, the guy returned again. This time he invited Sena to the pastry shop. For a couple of days, he came every day and with a smile invited the heroine somewhere. This time, realizing that objections were pointless, she invited Dion to come in as she needed to clean the house. The man immediately accepted the invitation, thanked her, and entered the house. While wiping the dust, the heroine continued to think about the current situation and did not understand whether Dion was really going to come every single day. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock on the door. Since Sena said she wasn't expecting anyone today, Dion offered to open the door himself. Duke Carlman stood on the threshold. Seeing him, Dion slammed the door. But he still had to open the door and invite the Duke into the house. Sena felt uncomfortable because of the oppressive atmosphere between the Duke and Dion. However, she tried to remain calm because this was her home. Hearing the Duke say that he had come to propose to Sena, Dion abruptly interrupted him and said no. Rashid was outraged by Dion's tactlessness since he was not addressing him, but the guy continued to argue, and for some time, forgetting that they were in someone else's house, they argued. Finally, Sena's patience ran out, and she reminded the uninvited guests that this was her home. Hearing the heroine's words that she would throw them out of her house if things continued like this, they immediately remained silent. Sena was pleased with herself because she managed to show who was boss. Having achieved calm, she turned to the Duke and asked him what his proposal was. The Duke said that the basement of her new house was not in the best condition, and not only the basement. The girl replied that this was expected since the house was quite old. That's why the Duke announced that he was going to reconstruct the entire house. Hearing this, Sena began to worry about Ellen, because during these 2 months, while the Duke was away, she would have no one to protect her. Returning to his request, Rashid said that he would like to rent Sena's house during the reconstruction. Dion immediately expressed his disagreement. Even though it was not a purchase, but a lease, Dion was still against it. Ignoring Dion's protests, the Duke offered a contract with monthly payments. He immediately took out the documents and showed the conditions written there. Despite Dion's protests, Sena still decided to read the contract. When she saw the amount of the monthly payment, she was stunned. The Duke proudly announced that everything was written correctly and that he was going to pay exactly 500,000 rupees every month. Hearing about this, the girl immediately agreed, calling the Duke a precious guest. Rashid was glad that the girl accepted his proposal. Having made her final decision, Sena began signing the contract. Especially since living there, the Duke would be able to continue to protect Ellen. But Dion continued to protest. He insistently asked the heroine not to do this. He said that he could also pay her 500,000. Although the girl did not understand why he needed this. Seeing the guy's violent reaction, the Duke became interested in what Sena had to do with Dion. The heroine answered without hesitation that they were just friends. These words shocked Dion so much that he turned pale with surprise. The guy was clearly expecting something else. The Duke felt some relief. While Sena didn't understand what was going on around her, Dion was depressed by the information that the girl considered him just a friend. Having finished the conversation, the Duke was about to leave, leaving the contract on the table. As he headed for the exit, he said that he wanted to give the girl enough time to think things over, and added that she could add her own conditions. Sena was extremely surprised by the Duke's behavior. Compared to how he was when we first met, he now behaved much better. Not understanding the reasons for such a drastic change, Sena decided not to think about it. She began to study the contract. Dion watched with bated breath as Sena made changes to the contract. Having finished with the amendments, the girl showed the document to Dion to find out his opinion. But the guy was still offended by the phrase that they were just friends. The heroine didn't quite understand the reason for his bad mood. Suddenly, the guy asked with an offended voice if Sena was really going to sign this contract. Hearing a positive answer, he excitedly asked why she had refused that time. It was about the case when the Duke wanted to buy Sena's house. The girl replied that now the circumstances have changed, especially since that time he insisted on buying the house, but now he just wants to rent it for a while. But Dion was still dissatisfied. He continued to mumble that he himself could lend that much money to Sena. Hearing this, the heroine replied that it was not only about money, she needed a Duke. This information greatly shocked the guy. Then Sena explained that it was the Duke who helped Ellen and drove away the thieves who broke into her house. Also, according to a recently overheard conversation, the purple-haired man is going to visit Ellen again. And if the Duke stays in her house, he will be able to help his neighbor if necessary. Sena recalled that it was Dion who said that Ellen would be better off with the Duke. After listening to Sena's answer, Dion realized that it was because of his words that the girl accepted Carlman's proposal. Looking at the guy's upset face, the heroine did not understand why his mood had deteriorated so much. A few days later, the Duke was busy moving into a new house. At this time, Sena was analyzing the view from the window of the house. The girl was pleased that she had a good view of Ellen's house from there. While she felt relieved that the Duke would be able to keep an eye on Ellen from there, Sena was also confused as to why she was so worried about her ordinary neighbor. She had several theories about this, the most plausible of which were that Ellen was the main character of the novel, or that Sena was sick from the thought that her neighbor had to run away from her terrible family. Her thoughts were interrupted by someone's footsteps. It was the Duke. He reported that all his things had already been delivered, and the workers, having finished their work, said goodbye to the mistress of the house. After the departure of his lordship's subordinates, the heroine first of all hastened to remind them of the terms of the contract. Having heard the man's answer that he remembered everything, Sena decided to check how true this was. The Duke was depressed that he had to retell this contract for the 100th time. But he still began to list the points written there by the heroine. He listed all 7 points in one breath, and at the end, he added Sena's condition that, if even one of these points is violated, the contract will be cancelled. Hearing Carlman's answer, Sena warmly praised the Duke, but such praise did not particularly please the guy. A joyful Aaron, who was excited about the move, intervened in the conversation. However, he had a question. Since the assistant saw Dion for the first time, he became curious about who he was. The Duke replied with a grin that he was Sena's friend. For Dion, these words were like a blow to the head. Barely containing his anger, Dion greeted the Duke with a forced smile. The oppressive atmosphere between them could be felt a mile away. At this time, Aaron told Sena about the house's usage schedule, according to which the Duke planned to stay in the rented house 1 or 2 days a week, and his nights would be there on the other days. Having said everything he had to, he said goodbye and quickly left the house. The girl said goodbye to her assistant in bewilderment. She didn't know how to calm Dion and Carlman. Sena turned to the Duke, trying to stop the conflict, but he ignored her words. She also turned to Dion with a request to stop the dispute, but also to no avail. Realizing that none of the men were listening to her, she had to directly intervene between them to get their attention. In order to separate them once and for all, she asked Dion to leave, as it was already late. Dion was surprised by such a request, but Sena hurried to send him away so that he could go home and get some sleep. She was angry and blamed herself for bringing these two together in one room. The heroine insistently asked to return tomorrow or in a few days, but suddenly noticed that the door was not opening. The Duke came to the noise and asked what had happened. Dion was very glad that the door was stuck and he wouldn't be able to go home. And again, these three found themselves in the same room, at the same table. Sena was in a daze. She did not understand how it was even possible that the door was not locked and would not open. The Duke clarified that not only the door but also the windows do not open, which creates the feeling that they are inside some kind of barrier. Dion was extremely pleased with the situation. So there were 3 people sitting at the round table, one of whom was happy, the second was depressed, and the third was angry. The Duke and Sena immediately thought that it could be another demon, and having taken out the device, the heroine decided to test this assumption. They were shocked when their hypothesis was confirmed. None of them expected this. The stone on the device glowed bright red, which meant that there was a demon hiding in the house, but it was impossible to determine how long it had been there. Seeing the heroine's expression, Dion became worried and asked if she was okay. For Sena, it was a home filled with precious memories. She swore to herself that she would protect this place. Sena silently stood up from her seat and headed